early work, there was no question I was seduced by the beauty of the material, like we all were. I had to learn from my material through the process and my own personal growth what this stuff meant to me.
The origin of Ellsworth's forms are routed in ceramic pots, but have never been limited to these designs. Instead, they speak clearly and directly about the medium of wood, in such a way that each piece could be made from no other material. As a sculptor, each piece is designed to be a one-of-a-kind and in direct response to what he sees in the raw wood. Ellsworth's dynamics are both explosive and sensitive to the situation at hand, whether at leisure at the local pub or masterfully creating a piece at the lathe.
David Ellsworth first exhibited his hollow-turned wood forms in 1976. He introduced the craft world to a new language that would forever challenge the traditional understanding of the terms bowl and vessel.
I started turning in 1958. I was 14 at the time in the classic junior high school woodshop class. And I turned through junior high and through high school when I got my first lathe. And then I went into the Army for 3 years, and then into architecture school, and then into fine arts, and ended up in 8 years in college. And near the end of my graduate work, I went back to the lathe. And I really don't know why. It's possible that the lathe was just there sitting and I needed that kind of centering or recentering process. But I did go in with somewhat of a vengeance. It's just that I couldn't show the turned objects in the fine arts program that I was in. So when I got out of college in '73, this was the height of affirmative action, and of course I was the wrong everything and I couldn't get a job, and I really was seeking a continuum of that studio activity that I'd done in graduate work in sculpture. So I went into a little barn that I borrowed from a fellow in Boulder, Colorado, and rented space in there and worked for 2 years and began just turning and just about everything. Primarily salt and pepper and sugar shaker sets, which were or became my production item. And I turned I think in the next 3.5 years, I turned about 5,000 of those sets. And they sold for $18 on the market. You know, it was great. You're talking with people, you're communicating, you're getting responses. And in that period, which would have been about '74, I started to investigate this idea of hollow forms, and that certainly came from my experience when I was in undergraduate school of throwing pots, clay department. And I had studied a lot of historical clay work throughout different eras, different cultures. So I was really fairly well grounded in the vessel as a concept. It truly was not my intent in the very beginning to make or to go charging into making something new and different. It just suddenly evolved naturally. The holes got closer and closer and smaller and smaller. And the challenge was there, without question. So by 1976, I had finally acquired enough skill to really challenge the technical part, and then I could begin to really emerge into the designing portion of it. The first pieces were very tight, very hard edge, And it wasn't until I got out into the market and was exposed to different people around the country, in particular Mark Lindquist and the dynamic qualities of the materials and the approach that he was using, that I realized that my life had begun to open up, my work had begun to open up, the materials that were available to me became broader and more dynamic. And then eventually when I moved to the East Coast and had, in Pennsylvania, and had this wealth of species available to me, is when the power of the work really came out. Think of woodworking as an extractive process.
Okay.
In other words, if you start from the tree and you go to a vessel or you go to veneer or whatever to make furniture, you're constantly reducing the tree, removing a little bit and learning each step along the way. So what I'm doing here is starting either with a raw log or a burl or whatever material I select, and then I use the gouge with the long edge to rough out quickly the material so I can learn more about it and establish the parameters of height and diameter and et cetera. And as I'm doing that, I'm stopping and checking the material and seeing things that emerge that I might be looking for, I might have anticipated, or that might surprise me along the way. And I'll favor in those factors in order to develop the form. Once the form begins to take shape, then I begin to refine it with the shearing cuts. But I'm not going to the material with a specific design in mind. I let it happen as an interactive process. So in that respect, it's a great joy because I'm not limited to what I already know. I'm adding to my knowledge and experience as I go along.
I know that form is a real important aspect of your work. I didn't realize that you didn't come to the piece of wood without that form in mind. So that the interior of the wood really dictates a lot of where you're going to go with that piece.
It definitely has a lot to do with it. Sure, wood has its own glaze on it, and I want to be able to respond to that. I don't want to overpower the wood with technique, although it may appear that with the large cuts. But the large cuts get me, or allow me to get to, a better understanding of the material. And if there's something in there that is responding back to me, I don't want to overlook it, or I will feel like I'm overpowering the process. Today, most of the materials that I use are right off my property. I do on occasion, if I see just a fabulous chunk of wood in somebody else's firewood pile or in a display somewhere at a conference, I will pick it up, and I'm not adverse to doing that as long as I know where it came from. But what I have taken pieces of wood that have been laying around in the woods, in my woods, for 2 or 3 years, and I check them with a chainsaw every once in a while. Just cut off the end, scope in on it, see what it's doing. If it's ready, I go for it. If it's not ready, I'll let it wait. Oftentimes it goes beyond where I want it to be, then it becomes firewood or just the forest floor. But I like to cycle my experience with the materials here on the property so that I have a best advantage of moving from object to object to object over time. And it gives me a greater sense of the development of the forms as along or parallel with the development of the materials.
David, it's obvious to me that this environment has to play a part in your work.
Very much so. It reflects in a way how we perceive materials, our understanding of their perfection or imperfection, if you wish. I mean, look at this rock with a crack going down. We look at a rock like that and we say, oh, well, that's normal for a rock to have a crack in it. We never think twice. But you look at a piece of wood and you see a crack in it and you go, there's something wrong here. What I'm trying to do when I'm, quote, designing a piece is fundamentally draw out of it what its own power has and translate that into a new form or a new concept or a new approach to that object. So if I see a crack in a material, I gravitate towards that as an element of potential, something I can work with, as opposed to what we think of wood as an inherent beauty, like curly or quilted or something that's really quite obviously spectacular. Also, the crack in the vessel to me represents that inner volume wishing to come out. And the wood, the material itself, and another reason why I turn them so thin, is that I conceive of it as rather like the veil, holding that back, surrounding it, defining its volume, indicating its pulse and its movement. And that's what crack is all about in that. It's that level of almost yin-yang, it's that imperfection towards perfection. And if I can capture that in a visual as well as a physical manner, then the piece will live forever. It's always responding to me in some form, or whomever might have it or see it. And that way, the piece doesn't become stale or stagnant. It's like a mirror, you know. You look in a mirror, you see yourself. You look in a piece of wood, you can see yourself if you know what to look for. But you're relating to that object as a person, as a species, as a personality. And I want that to continue forever in the growth of the object in relation to the growth of the person.
So you look at that crack as more of an enrichment in that piece than a flaw, as some might think.
Absolutely. I think artists in general have always challenged language and perception in culture. And I think that I know when I came into woodworking and wood turning in the early 70s, the perception was fine craft, fine art, fine furniture, and for quite obvious reasons. What I wanted to do was to look beyond the fineness, to conceive of it linguistically and spiritually as an interactive part of me as a personality. And there's a cracked personality there without question, and I'm exposing that imperfection in me as part of the total of me into the material, to the total of the object. That's why I work in vessel forms. It's a direct reflection of the human as the ultimate vessel.
Well, another thing that I've enjoyed of your work is the line, the silhouette that your pieces create. And more recently, I've noticed that the grain of the wood doesn't seem to be as important to me anymore either. It's that silhouette. There's this one piece that I was just looking at, and it just has such a pleasant form that you're just drawn into it for no other reason than its shape.
Well, I think that's a combination of things. It's certainly within my maturity. It's also evolved with human forms, you know, like the belly of a pregnant woman, or the tension in the calf, or I mean, this is where I'm talking about line as volume as opposed to line as shape. One should be able to see something from a great distance and become excited by it. Its periphery, its silhouette, if you wish. And then as you get closer and closer, and in particular because it's wood, you become more engaged with it, more interrelative with that material, to include the grain. But it doesn't need to stand up and shout at you right from the very outset. It might shout a little too loud. My primary influences come outside of the crafted arts. I think it starts with Mary Frank, who's a sculptress in New York, who taught me how to draw when I was a student at the New School in the 60s, New School for Social Research. And then Jerry Kunkel, who was a painter at the University of Colorado, who taught me how to integrate thought with objects and develop concepts. And Paul Solner, who is a ceramist himself, very well known in the West Coast, who taught me how to work.
David, one of the series that I've really enjoyed is the Man in the Forest architecture series. We got a glimpse of that earlier today. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was great fun. In moving here in '81 from that sparse, high-altitude forest in the west and then coming to this dense, varied species forest and decomposition and whatever, I began to recognize, as I was learning about the different trees here, gestures and personalities of trees, even trees growing together and kissing one another, you know, and reemerging, or two trees of different species growing out of the same space. And I needed a way to represent that in my work that wasn't confined to the vessel as a concept. I needed it really to be more dimensional, more sculptural, more three-dimensional for certain. So I happened to find a beautiful spalted sugar maple log up in New Hampshire, too spalted to make vessels out of, but the perfect opportunity and material to use this material rather to make these forms. So they were fundamentally cylindrical forms, hollow tubes, which I cut with a chainsaw and then reburied in spalted shavings to reintroduce more spalting to them. And then they were pitched on angles to give gestural forms, male forms, female forms, elderly form, teenager forms, and I could work with them with the camera and juxtapose one another and actually get little scenarios going with these things. And it was great fun for me because I could present these slide photographic scenarios without sound. Just click the slides and people suddenly could immediately place themselves with these small objects in these dioramas, so to speak, and relate directly to them. And it didn't matter if they were sculpture or bowls or vessels or whatever. It was a way of integrating and people with people through objects. And I've got another log now. I'm going to revisit that series and carry it on from there. The 53-inch piece in the redwood burl that you saw was the pinnacle piece of that series, and that was done in the early to mid-'80s.
What's the new series that you're working on?
Well, I'm going to revisit the Solstice series again. These are the pieces that were painted and burned and that were fundamentally not bowls, they were not vessels, they were sculptural form. I would like to revisit that series again 10 years after the first series. Burned pieces is certainly nothing new to me. I mean, mankind has been burning wood since trees came down, I suppose. But the reason that I use the burned technique to material is to bring out a quality of the lineal quality of the material, like an ash, which is a very strong, hard winter grain adjacent to a soft summer grain. The burning process brings out the lineal quality of the grain throughout the curvilinear nature of the vessel form. And in doing that, I'm not negating the quality of the wood. I'm bringing that quality up, but I'm creating a very different type of an object. It's the difference, for instance, between a stoneware used in clay and a porcelain. It's the difference between using maple and oak. They're different materials, and I can handle them in a very versatile manner. It all depends on what my attitude about the object is and how I respond to that material. If I burn a piece of ash used in one object, I may sand and polish the next one, and it may have come from the same tree. But I will come up with a distinctly different object, and it's that variety, if you wish, it's that palette of approaches to the material and the textures and the net effect at the end that I'm interested in.
I especially love the burnishing that you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, it gives it such a ceramic quality to it, a depth that you wouldn't expect from something that was burnt.
It is a ceramic quality, and I think that wooden vessels are fundamentally ceramic forms. They all evolve from ceramic forms, different cultures, different eras. When I was working ceramics as an undergraduate, I was thrilled with raku and the effects that one would get from the burnishing of the fire and textures on the surface and different colorations, almost as if it's a translucent surface interplaying with one area to another or with one another. So when I'm working with the fire, I'm not interested in totally blackening the object, which would be all right, but I want to take it a step farther. So I'll possibly blacken a certain region and just scorch a certain other area. And then when I polish that down, I get that amber tone, and it emerges through. It's really a very exciting process. And it's exciting to work with fire because, gosh, I mean, it's such a violent process. We all know the connotation of fire. But when you can handle it subtly and watch this thing interplay and emerge, it becomes terribly exciting in the form. And then when you take the object and you put it in different lights and you rotate it, it picks up, sometimes it appears totally silhouette-ish black, and other times it appears like a translucent surface. It draws you into that surface. It engages you. And there the piece never becomes stale. It always has an interactive life of its own with the individual that's observing it. The thing I enjoy is not predicting in advance what it's going to be, because if I do, I'm going to miss something along the way. That's fundamentally the philosophy that I've always had to the material of wood, is the level of discovery through the process to get to a statement at the end. So if I'm, for instance, working with a material that I'm uncertain of, that maybe it's one that I haven't worked with before, I take it very slow. I want to gain a relationship with that material. For the simple reason that if I just overpower the object with superlative technique, if you wish, I'm going to end up with a dead object later on down the line. I want it to pulsate. I want it to live. It can change color. It can oxidize with the sun. It can do anything it wants to. But if it developed with a sense of passion, if it was considered along the way, if you wish, I don't mean that to sound trite, but it's absolutely true. Then when it's done, that last brushstroke, so to speak, will be evident. You know when to stop. You just learn it over time. Otherwise, everything starts looking the same.
Sure. Well, why don't you go ahead and show us what the next process is?
Let's hollow this guy out.
Okay.
thank you very much for your time. We've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining me on our visit with David Ellsworth. As you've seen, David's work is distinguished not only by its breadth and dimension, but also his ability to interpret concepts of the vessel form as a direct reflection of himself, the human vessel. As such, his works speak very much to the soul of ourselves, as they are intimately reflective, indeed poetic. It is through this palette of personal expression that we are rewarded with such a rare glimpse of the artist behind the work. Thank you for joining me in this edition of Beyond Wood, Portrait of an Artist.